Good morning. The Subcommittee on Energy and Mineral Resources will come to order. The Subcommittee is meeting today to hear testimony on the Trump administration's record of what are broken promises on renewable energy. Under Committee Rule 4F, any oral opening statements at hearings are limited to the chairman and the ranking minority member or their designees. I'm going to ask unanimous consent that all other members' opening statements be made part of the hearing record if they're submitted to the subcommittee clerk by 5 p.m. today. Hearing no objections, so ordered. Without objection, the chair may also declare a recess subject to the call of the chair. Hearing no objection, that's so ordered. As described in the notice, statements, documents, or motions must be submitted to the electronic repository at hnrcdocs@mail.house.gov. All right. Additionally, please note that as with in-person meetings, members are responsible for their own microphones. As with our in-person meetings, members can be muted by staff only to avoid inadvertent background noise. Finally, members or witnesses experiencing technical problems should inform committee staff immediately. When President Trump took office, nobody believed that a climate denier would suddenly transform into a climate champion. Right from the start, the administration started rolling back critical protections for clean air and clean water, promoting massive new fossil fuel developments, and systematically attacking the role of sound science in federal policy making. President Trump even claimed that wind turbines cause cancer, and more recently that the climate will magically start cooling. But in the midst of all this chaos, there were glimmers of hope that leadership at the Department of the Interior actually understood the enormous economic benefits of renewable energy. Secretary Zinke came in promoting a so-called all-of-the-above vision of energy dominance. He published an op-ed promising that on designated federal lands and offshore, that this means there would be an equal opportunity for all sources of responsible energy development, from fossil fuels to the full range of renewables. In a speech, Secretary Zinke said, "I'm bullish on wind. I think this is a win for America." President Trump's executive order promoting energy independence specifically mentioned opportunities for renewable energy. And there has been some progress, but the results have not matched the rhetoric. We are not dominating the world in renewable energy. In fact, in total amounts of spent, we're a distant second to China in renewable energy investments. And we're rapidly going backwards on climate change. These problems were pre-baked into this administration well before the coronavirus pandemic disrupted all of our lives. For example, immediately upon coming into office, the Trump administration dismantled the Renewable Energy Coordination Office at the Department of Interior, casting aside years of clean energy expertise. Vineyard Wind, which is expected to become the nation's first large-scale offshore wind farm, has been delayed by over a year and a half. This has led to a cascading series of delays for other projects that are similarly awaiting BOEM permits. For over 2 years, BOEM has promised that it would open up new areas in New York and California for offshore wind development. But these efforts have mysteriously stalled. The picture isn't much better on land. While the Trump administration has offered over 24 million acres for oil and gas leasing at dirt cheap prices, they haven't held, and I repeat that, they haven't held any competitive lease sales for wind or solar. In the midst of the coronavirus pandemic, when the BLM was scrambling to provide royalty breaks for oil and gas companies as quickly as they could, BLM demanded millions of dollars in rental payments from wind and solar companies. The starkly different ways that this administration treats oil and gas compared to renewable energy couldn't be any clearer. Time and time again, they favor fossil fuels and they scorn renewable energy. Any progress whatsoever on renewable energy over the past 4 years is truly, we thank state leadership and private sector companies working tooth and nail to overcome obstacle after obstacle thrown in their way by the Trump administration. Both the Bureau of Land Management and the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management were invited to testify at today's hearing, but they refused to show up. There is no excuse for this lack of urgency. Every year that we fail to make progress on clean energy increases the costs to future generations in addressing climate change. It is also an enormous missed opportunity to create jobs and to help our nation recover from our ongoing economic recession. Today's hearing is an opportunity to hear from experts and how we can once again jumpstart our clean energy transition in ways that are environmentally sustainable, that are equitable, and that will create jobs all across the country. I now recognize my Ranking Member Gosar, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Lowenthal. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
And I want to thank the witnesses for taking the time to join us today to discuss the Trump administration's outstanding record on renewable energy development. Yes, you heard it. Judging by the politically charged title of today's hearing, I expect my colleagues will point the finger at this administration and blame it for the lack of renewable energy development on our federal lands and outer continental shelf. However, that effort is deeply misguided. The Trump administration has been a leader on renewable energy development on federal lands and waters. While this administration has lagged behind development on state and private lands, it is not because of the alleged politically motivated bias. Instead, it is the result of direct actions by the Obama administration. It is the same fundamental disparity caused by the unappealing regulatory environment that developers face on federal lands as compared to the more efficient permitting process and more favorable economic opportunities available on state and private lands. The Trump administration took office in January of 2017. In December of 2016, the Obama administration upended nearly a decade of federal lands renewable policy by implementing a new competitive processes, terms, and conditions for leasing public lands for solar and wind energy development rule. That rule pushed development of off-broad areas of federal lands into specifically designated leasing areas, roughly taking 98% of the federal land off the table for solar and wind leasing. It increased costs, created a new complicated competitive process, and was clear it would slow down renewable activity on federal lands. This resulted in the near universal opposition to the rule from trade associations representing wind and solar development. To that point, I wanted to submit for the record a 2016 Christian Science Monitor article titled "Federal Land Rule Pits Green Groups Against Wind and Solar Firms." Chairman.
So ordered.
Thank you. But it isn't just the Obama administration's rules that are killing renewable development on federal lands. It's overall permitting timelines. I want to point to a Federal Energy Regulatory Commission report on barriers and opportunities for high voltage transmission. I want to submit this report for the record. Chairman.
Objection. So ordered.
Issued in June of 2020, the FERC report provides further evidence of how difficult and time-consuming it is to develop interstate transmission lines, as well as the immense electrical and economic benefits such as transmission lines can provide to America. Mr. Chairman, when you can't build transmission, you can't build generation, and in the Western United States, that is the overwhelming challenge. As this report makes clear, FERC found, quote, that while opportunities exist, there are also barriers to which make development of high voltage transmission challenging. For instance, siting of high voltage transmission, generally an area of state jurisdiction, requires navigating each state process or multiple state processes for an interstate high voltage transmission facility. Various other authorizations and reviews are also generally required at the federal, state, and local levels. Additionally, the time required to develop a high voltage transmission facility that meets mandatory reliability standards maximizes system benefits and strikes a balance among interested stakeholders, including states, can be in excess of a decade, end of quote. Let me state that again. Transmission that benefits everyone, the grid, industry, consumers, can take in excess of a decade. This administration has made remarkable progress on approving renewable energy projects, largely due to the administration's directive aimed at removing regulatory red tape. Thanks to the clear directives in Executive Order 13807 and Secretarial Order 3355 to streamline the NEPA process and new tools like the Fast 41 dashboard, this administration has permitted several solar, wind, and geothermal projects on time and even ahead of schedule. The list of administrative successes is significant using Fast 41. The administration approved both the Gemini Solar Project and the Desert Quartzsite Solar Project, while the Yellow Pine Solar Project is expected to see a decision before the end of 2020. In addition, the Borderlands Wind Project near Socorro, New Mexico received a record of decision ahead of schedule on August 3rd, 2020. Geothermal energy development has seen significant approvals as well, with new projects coming online and proposed in Nevada. There are also promising developments from offshore wind on the OCS. This is the Trump administration. It is the Trump administration that built the first offshore wind turbines in U.S. federal waters off the state of Virginia. The Trump administration that hosted a wind lease sale generating a record-breaking $405 million in bonus bid revenues. While the administration has been moving forward during difficult, detailed scientific work that will decide Vineyard's wind future and opportunity to issue a record of decision this year, this committee and this Congress are going in the opposite direction. If you want to point fingers at slowing offshore wind, look in the mirror. It is this subcommittee that just last September held a massive hearing in New Jersey with 3 panels highlighting the threat to offshore fishing from offshore wind and urging a slowdown of the process. This committee has also failed to expand offshore wind to the U.S. territories by partisan legislation that has passed Congress but sits bottled up here with a hold by the majority. It is this Democratic majority that this week This week, we'll vote on an amendment to the energy legislation calling for more research on impacts between offshore wind and fishing, making it clear you don't trust the current science and want a slower process. You can try and point the fingers at the president, but it's this Congress that continues to act to undercut the science, the process, and the opportunity for offshore wind. If my colleagues feel that these projects should be able to get through the review process even faster, then I hope they'll join us as we work to advance meaningful, responsible regulatory reform through the legislative process. We all know that the consultation review requirements under the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA, the Endangered Species Act, and the Migratory Birds Treaty Act can drag out the regulatory process for a decade or even more yet, somehow longer. The state and private land projects are permitted in significantly less time. In the short term, my colleague Representative Fulcher has a bill that proposed NEPA reforms for geothermal testing sites that has not received a vote in committee. I'm also disappointed that the majority, for the second time now, has included my bill, the Public Lands Renewable Energy Development Act, in one of their partisan legislative packages and removed key elements from the bill that would have expedited renewable energy on the Forest Service managed lands. Lastly, I'm also proud to have co-sponsored a bill introduced by my colleague, Representative Graves, just yesterday to codify the common sense NEPA reforms developed by the Council on Environmental Quality. I would like to submit for the record comments from the American Wind Energy Association on the administration's NEPA reform proposal.
Without objection, so ordered.
And finally, I want to thank our Republican witness, Mr. Aaron Smith, for taking the time to be with us today for this important discussion. Offshore wind development presents a major opportunity for job growth, but it is important that this new industry is developed thoughtfully with a focus on domestic job growth. It does America no good to offshore American jobs in our own offshore. We have a responsibility to ensure that Americans have a fair shake and are being considered for jobs in this industry. I look forward to the conversation today, and with that, I yield back. Thanks for your indulgence, Alan.
Thank you. I'm now going to introduce our witnesses for today. Kate Kelly is the Public Lands Director at the Center for American Progress and previously worked at the Department of the Interior. Ann Reynolds is the Executive Director of the Alliance for Clean Energy New York, an Albany-based nonprofit. Dan Shugar is the founder and CEO of Next Tracker, a global solar innovation and technology company. And Aaron Smith is the president and CEO of Offshore Marine Services Association. Let me remind the witnesses that under our committee rules, they must limit their oral statements to 5 minutes, but that their entire statements will appear in the hearing record. When you begin, the timer will begin, and it will turn orange when you have 1 minute remaining. I recommend that members and witnesses joining remotely use the quotes grid view so that they may pin the timer on their screen. After your testimony is complete, please remember to mute yourself to avoid any inadvertent background noise. I will also allow the entire panel to testify before questioning any of the witnesses. I now recognize Ms. Kelly for 5 minutes. Welcome to the committee.
Thank you. Thanks, Chair Lowenthal and Ranking Member Gosar. Good afternoon. My name is Kate Kelly. I'm the Public Lands Director at the Center for American Progress. And prior to this, I served in the Obama administration at the Interior Department. There are 2 points I'd like to convey during my time. The first, I hope, comes across as obvious. We need clean, renewable energy in order to fight climate change and strengthen America's economy. The second point, unfortunately, is that the Trump administration is actively stifling wind and solar development on public land and waters. Public lands in the ocean boast some of the best wind and solar resources in the world, and importantly, there are paths to harness that energy in an environmentally responsible way. But decades of policies and politics that heavily favor fossil fuel extraction have tilted the scales so that public lands and waters are part of the climate change problem, not part of the solution. In fact, the U.S. Geological Survey found that energy extraction on federally managed lands and oceans has been contributing about 7 times more greenhouse gas emissions than they have been absorbing. We need to flip that equation, but it will require a major shift in how and why we manage these places that belong to all Americans. The Obama administration began that work. They stood up and staffed onshore and offshore renewable energy development programs at the Interior Department. They approved dozens of wind, solar, and geothermal projects with potential to power millions of homes. They conducted landscape level planning, creating solar energy zones in the Southwest and wind energy areas in the Atlantic Ocean, ensuring projects could be sited in areas with high energy potential and low environmental conflict. They held first of their kind competitive lease sales, and they built a framework for renewable energy development to provide industry and stakeholders with shared rules of the road. But there was more to be done when they handed the keys over in 2017, which brings me to my second point. The Trump administration's Interior Department has done little to advance responsible renewable energy development. Whatever the reasons for this, whether it stems from sheer neglect or outright hostility or both, the impacts are the same: the stunted growth of clean energy development on public lands and the ocean. I think why I've been asked to testify today is because my colleague, Nicole Gentili, and I reviewed the Interior Department's activities during the Trump administration and found that they had approved about half as many wind and solar projects than the Obama administration had at the same point in the first term. While that statistic received the most attention from the media, our other findings in the report are probably just as troubling. The Trump administration has eliminated the Bureau of Land Management's Renewable Energy Office. They have missed opportunities to create new designated leasing areas, a tool designed to provide certainty to developers and stakeholders alike. They have failed to hold a single onshore renewable energy lease sale, and they have thrown up roadblocks to slow or stop proposed wind and solar projects. I'm happy to elaborate on any of these findings, but it adds up to, in my mind, a waste of 4 years when our economy and our climate doesn't have a moment to spare. I should note that the dismantling of the Interior Department's renewable energy programs has come at the same time that the Trump administration has rolled out the red carpet for the oil and gas industry, holding massive and frequent lease sales, offering breaks on royalty payments, writing oil and gas into every land management plan, and rolling back standards perceived to be a hurdle to fossil fuel development. The treatment of the two industries could not be more different. I'll close by offering that regardless of the outcome in November's election, there's a promising opportunity for Congress to create jobs and strengthen the renewable energy program at the Interior Department. The Public Lands Renewable Energy Development Act, a bill that enjoys bipartisan support from members on this committee, would clean up some loose ends left by the existing competitive wind and solar rule and make for an enduring program at the Bureau of Land Management. Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, for holding this hearing.
Thank you, Ms. Kelly. I now recognize Ms. Reynolds for 5 minutes. Welcome to the committee.
Thank you, Chair Lowenthal, and all the members of the subcommittee for the opportunity to speak to you today. I work for the Alliance for Clean Energy, which promotes the clean energy industry in New York State. Our industry supported more than 158,000 jobs in 2018, and we want to continue to create jobs and be part of New York's economic revitalization in a state and in a nation so deeply affected by coronavirus. I want to focus my remarks today on offshore wind, but to first put that in context, I note that in order for my state to achieve the aggressive goals in our landmark climate law, we need the full range of technologies. That means investments in building retrofits and efficient lighting and efficient appliances, the construction of, is he speaking? Can I be heard?
Yes, we all hear you.
Okay.
Clearly.
I'm sorry.
We will not lose any time for stop.
I was afraid you were speaking. I want to focus on offshore wind, but I also want to say that we need the full range of technologies. That means building retrofits, that means construction of rooftop and grid scale solar, continuing investment in our legacy hydro plants, new transmission, strategic deployment of batteries, and the construction of land-based and offshore wind power. New York's climate law specifically requires the development of 9,000 megawatts of offshore wind, roughly enough to power 6 million homes. And New York has hit the ground running and has already signed contracts for 2 projects totaling 1,700 megawatts And those two projects alone will generate more than 1,600 good-paying jobs and some 80 million in port investments. And right now, another offshore wind solicitation is on the street in New York for up to 2,500 megawatts. Bids are due this fall. And this is all great news for job creation in New York. So now the bad news. If additional wind energy areas are not made available by the federal government, offshore wind could be stopped in its tracks. Because New York is not the only state committed to this technology. New Jersey has a 7,500 megawatt goal, and other New England states have goals as well. As you know, federal lands are leased for offshore wind development by the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, or BOEM, and the existing BOEM lease areas simply cannot accommodate the demand in the Northeast, let alone the states of New York and New Jersey. Designating new lease areas is critical to allowing this industry to flourish, and we need the federal government to act. The New York Bight has been under evaluation by BOEM for several years, and BOEM has received extensive input from the state of New York, the commercial fishing industry, and many other stakeholders. BOEM identified draft wind energy areas announced in November 2018 and was scheduled to finalize the designation by early 2019, but that decision appears to be in limbo. Wood Mackenzie study examined the economic benefits associated with BOEM leasing, and the results were impressive. It covered several areas of the country, but in terms of just leasing areas in the New York Bight, the study projects 32,000 annual jobs during the development and construction phase, 5,800 annual O&M jobs, and $828 million for the U.S. Treasury from lease sales. In short, the opportunity we have before us is significant, and it certainly comes at a time when new jobs and additional funds for the U.S. Treasury are sorely needed. Offshore wind companies are ready to invest and make this new American industry a reality. Our federal colleagues have a unique, once-in-a-generation opportunity to unlock this potential, and we don't need new legislation or new rulemaking to make this happen. We just need a decision on the wind energy areas. The second federal role I want to mention is environmental review and permitting. It goes without saying that offshore wind projects should and do require a thorough environmental review. The first project to advance completed an environmental impact statement and then a supplemental environmental impact statement focused on the cumulative impacts of all the wind projects that are reasonably foreseeable. And all of these leaseholders included in the cumulative review have voluntarily agreed to a 1-by-1 nautical mile spacing to address concerns raised by stakeholders. So BOEM has undergone a thorough and protective process, but their decision in this first case is critical to the future, and we're hopeful that BOEM will complete this review by December. To conclude, the federal government can and should facilitate the growth of this industry. So far, 2020 has taught us many lessons as a country, and whether we are focusing on COVID-19 or raging wildfires, one of those lessons is the importance of clean air to breathe. With renewable electricity, we can tackle climate change, improve air quality, and power our future. So thank you so much again for the opportunity to speak to you today about renewable energy.
Thank you very much, Ms. Reynolds. And now I recognize Dan Shugar for 5 minutes of testimony. Welcome to the committee, Dan.
Chairman Lowenthal, subcommittee members, thank you very much for the invitation to join you today. I'm the founder and CEO of Nextracker. We are the largest global manufacturer of structures and control systems for solar power plants. We have a 30% global market share. So I'm bringing experience in other countries to bear today in our discussions, and we serve about half the U.S. market. I'd like to really thank the subcommittee for focusing on these items of interest in renewables for natural resources. I also serve on the Solar Energy Industries Association and bring, as a professional electrical engineer, 34 years of utility operations and renewable experience to the table here. So let's take stock. Solar has actually grown a lot in the last 4 years. We've grown from in the United States, 30 to 83 gigawatts. That's a 270% increase in capacity, and jobs have grown from 200,000 to 250,000, which is 3 times more jobs than the coal industry. There are hundreds of projects.
Dan, can everybody mute their microphones except for the person speaking? We're getting a lot of background noise. Thank you. Dan.
Jobs over the last 4 years have grown from 200,000 to 250,000, over 3 times more jobs than the coal industry. Today, there are hundreds of projects under construction in the U.S., and Texas is actually the largest market. And what's really new in solar is how amazingly cost-effective it's become. In fact, solar is the lowest cost way to generate power today. We've achieved a 37% reduction in cost. And today, solar, as a matter of public record, the projects are being done, meaning firm contracts are being executed with utilities under long-term power purchase agreements for $20 to $24 per megawatt hour for large projects, including battery energy storage. That's 1/3 the cost of new coal power, 1/5 the cost of new nuclear, and significantly less than the average cost of generating power in the utility grid today. So there's a huge savings opportunity. The Solar Energy Industries Association has a goal of 20% of the country's power coming from solar by 2030. And by doing that, we'll actually save utility ratepayers, basically folks in their homes and businesses, over $10 billion a year in energy costs, while we're creating hundreds of thousands of jobs and providing very enormous benefits for clean air and clean water. Okay, so we've had all this progress, but this progress has happened despite policy. It's happened as a result of the cost reduction benefits that have happened, and technology and entrepreneurialism. We have the opportunity to radically accelerate what we've done in solar to create more jobs and more benefits to the environment. Okay, speaking on public lands, the Bureau of Land Energy Management, let's just speak to their jurisdiction and the tens of millions of acres that are available in sunny areas for solar power. So first, we want to recognize there are great staff at BLM that have worked really hard to approve some specific solar projects, such as Ranking Member Gosar mentioned the Gemini project in Nevada. However, the rules are broken. And without diving into the weeds, let me summarize it like this. It takes far too long, over 3 years, to get solar projects approved. And those projects have costs that are 10 times higher than competitive lease rates. They should be use costs like grazing and things like that. So we need to fix that, come together and do so in a way that's environmentally responsible. There's been bipartisan support for this, but we need to get it done and basically unleash those lands and then provide the benefit of those that royalty income to the American public. Beyond the lands issue, there are basically 6 major policy items which need to be addressed by the administration and in Congress to further accelerate solar. One is there's the investment tax credit has been a great bipartisan vetted policy to accelerate renewable energy. The problem is too few companies are paying tax today as a result of the COVID situation and tax policy. So we need a provision called direct pay. So instead of applying for a tax credit, you essentially get a rebate. That's been done in other industries. It works. Secondly,
Mr. Shugar, can you try to close it out? You've kind of gone over the 5 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, I will. Extending the step down in the investment tax credit, because we've lost time with COVID, extending that by 2 years is the second thing. The third thing is we need to radically reduce or remove tariffs that have been imposed in the last few years on solar panels and raw materials, so we manufacture actually more here and don't have a tax that increases the cost of these components by 50% over what they cost overseas. We need to reform market rules, and as Ranking Member Gosar said, invest in strategic transmission. Finally, the federal government can actually procure energy, saving money on their utility bills and creating markets for energy. Thank you for the opportunity to present today.
Thank you, Mr. Shugar. I now recognize for 5 minutes, Mr. Smith. Welcome to the committee, Mr. Smith.
Chairman Lowenthal and Ranking Member Gosar and members of the committee, I appreciate everyone's time today. If someone were to propose the construction of a wind farm in, say, my native state of Colorado, utilizing a team of Russians, Chinese, and citizens from similar nations, such a project would and should face widespread opposition. However, visa holders from these nations are constructing the wind projects in our sovereign waters within sight of Massachusetts, Rhode Island, New Jersey, Virginia, and the rest of the East Coast. Today, I will highlight this problem and simple steps Congress can take to ensure that U.S. wind power produces U.S. jobs. AMSA and our members fully support the development of offshore wind as not only a source of clean energy, but also as an economic driver. Marine jobs are the very type of jobs U.S. public policy should be promoting. The median wage for the 33,000 men and women who serve as captains, mates, and ship pilots is more than $72,000 a year. Offshore energy mariners make even higher wages, with captains in our industry making $600 per day. Unfortunately, many AMSA members and the mariners they employ are shut out of the offshore wind market. Instead, we often find vessels flagged in the UK, Norway, Luxembourg, or flying a flag of convenience getting this work. Over the course of the summer, AMSA has been tracking the vessels serving in Northeast wind farms. On average, there are 12 to 15 foreign wind farm vessels doing work off our coast. The same day, there are at most 8 to 10 U.S. flag vessels in these fields. The mariners on these foreign vessels make shockingly less than the U.S. counterparts. One recent employment advertisement for crew positions on board international energy vessels offered the captain of the vessel $350 to $380 per day, and the deck crew $750 to $800 per month, or approximately $2 an hour. Obviously, these wages were not wages that U.S. workers should or would accept. We're talking about U.S. skilled mariners. Instead, these roles are being filled by Ukrainians, Russians, mariners from India, the Philippines, and China. These mariners come into the U.S. under a special maritime visa that provides no check to see if there are U.S. mariners available for these jobs. There's little oversight over the awarding of these visas, and the visas are good for 5 years. We recently examined the crew manifests of a Norwegian-owned, Bahamian-flagged energy vessel operating in U.S. waters. The vessel's crew included at least 4 Russian nationals, an equal number of Ukrainians, 2 Polish citizens, at least 5 from the Philippines. What were not found on that vessel were any citizens of Norway, any citizens of the United States, or the vessel's flagged country of Bahamas. These foreign mariners and their employers are exploiting an unintended loophole within OXLA. In this law, Congress directed that only U.S. citizens are allowed to crew vessels used for OCS operations. However, Congress sought to prevent retaliation against U.S. mariners from foreign companies by including what it thought would be a rarely used exception to the standard, allowing foreign mariners to serve on foreign-owned vessels when they're in U.S. waters. It is clear from the law's intent, the conference reports, and the debate transcripts that Congress intended this access to be reciprocal. And the only way such a reciprocal relationship works is if the foreign vessel's mariners and ownership are from the same country. Any other interpretation requires one to believe that Congress wanted to ensure our mariners had access to the waters of landlocked countries, or Congress was trying to protect our access to non-existent energy operations, or Congress thought that retaliating against one country would make another country do what we want them to. Unfortunately, the congressional intent is obviously not being honored. Instead, foreign owners from nations such as Norway employ foreign vessels in our waters, utilizing mariners not from Norway and not from the United States, but from low-wage nations. This is a problem Congress can fix today. AMSA proposes that Congress clarify OXLA by limiting the number of visas that can be issued for each foreign vessel. Congress should also require foreign owners regularly prove they still meet the qualifications for this exemption. Finally, Congress should restore its intent by clarifying that foreign owners employ their fellow citizens or U.S. citizens on their vessels when they operate in our waters. If these vessel owners cannot find enough of their fellow citizens or find their fellow citizens to be too expensive, then they should be hiring the skilled men and women in the U.S. Merchant Marine. These changes would go a long way to putting U.S. vessels on a level playing field with their international counterparts. These changes would address an estimated 60% of the cost differential between U.S. and international vessels. As stated, we would never allow foreign workers to construct onshore wind farms when there are U.S. workers capable of conducting these operations. And Congress can take steps right now to halt this practice from happening offshore. In doing so, we would ensure that the harnessing of U.S. wind creates U.S. jobs. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Mr. Smith. I want to thank all the panelists for their testimony. And I want to remind members of the committee of Rule 3D, which imposes a 5-minute limit on questions. Chairman will now recognize members of the committee for any questions they may wish to ask the witnesses. And I'm going to recognize myself for 5 minutes. First question is, Mr. Smith, are you aware, and will it help that we have an amendment today before the Energy Committee that was put forth by myself and also Mr. Garamendi, which is a bipartisan amendment with both Republican and Democratic support to really level the playing field in terms of offshore wind and offshore fossil fuel development, to require that offshore wind follow the same rules regarding the Jones Act as offshore fossil fuel. Will that help some of the issues that you've raised?
Congressman, Mr. Chairman, first, thank you again for your leadership on this issue, and thank you again and to your counterpart, Mr. Garamendi, for your amendment today, and to the Republican co-sponsors as well. Yes, that will help, Congressman, and AMSA fully supports your amendment. We do need to ensure that when the same vessel, the same AMSA member vessels that construct oil and gas projects, construct offshore wind projects. Therefore, they should face the same rules, and we should ensure that just because a foreign vessel is engaged in an offshore wind project, that it can't skirt our laws and come in and undercut a U.S. vessel. So yes, that amendment will certainly go forward and help this matter. I would say, Congressman, after we've spent millions of dollars over the last 12 years by our association trying to get the government to follow the law, we need to ensure we are being complete and explicit in all of these changes, because we're having to drag the administration kicking and screaming to enforcing our laws on offshore development. So again, thank you, sir.
I think later on we can continue this discussion to see how it goes. My next question is for Ms. Kelly. I want to ask a question to you regarding the Vineyard Wind Project. I think everyone was surprised when the Trump administration all of a sudden had a deep commitment to the importance of the National Environmental Policy Act. Has the Trump administration ever requested a supplemental cumulative impact statement for fossil fuel projects on public lands? And is this request for an expanded cumulative impact analysis consistent with the administration's overall position on NEPA?
Thanks for the question, Chair Lowenthal. I would love to be wrong about this, but I'm not aware of a comparable supplemental request for oil and gas during the Trump administration. I think there does appear to be a double standard applied here, and that the Trump administration is seeking this additional review for the offshore wind project. At the same time, they're in the process of gutting NEPA and hamstringing agencies from considering cumulative impacts and hearing adequate stakeholder input throughout the process. I would probably pivot to my fellow panelist, Anne, but for offshore wind projects, they will be undergoing and are undergoing 2 levels of environmental review. First, when the wind energy areas are first sited, to ensure they are at places where there's high potential and low conflict with other uses like fishing, tribal interests, military interests, but also site-specific review for the project itself. So these are certainly undergoing adequate or environmental review as development is proceeding.
Thank you. Ms. Reynolds, would you like to comment on that also, on the question?
Well, I would like to agree with what was said about the thorough review that these projects get, both when the wind energy area is established and then during the permitting phase. But I think one of the important things about Vineyard Wind is because it is the very first commercial scale project through this permitting process. And so it's being watched by the rest of the industry, and the decisions that they make in this project will affect the design of other projects going forward. There's about a half dozen projects waiting for their permitting process to get started. And so we are very much hoping that BOEM is able to stick to the current schedule that they've announced, which is completing the review of this first project by the end of December.
Thank you. And I'm going to be very brief. Real question to Mr. Shugar. Just, your company has offices all over the world. How would you compare the United States support for clean energy during this economic crisis compared to other countries throughout the world?
Thank you for the question.
And very short answer, because we're
sure. Just to focus on public lands, we have less than 10% of the solar on public lands compared to over 50% on public lands in other places. For example, last week in Dubai, our company was a 1 gigawatt project, was part of a 5 gigawatt project. By comparison, the Gemini project that was mentioned by Representative Gosar is less than 1 gigawatt. So we have more sun, more land, better opportunity. We just need to together get the rules right and get on with it.
Thank you. Sir, for his 5 minutes of questions. Thank you.
Can you hear me, Alan? Okay. Mr. Shugar, I'm going to go right back at you. I noticed in your testimony, and you stated, unfortunately, current policy for siting and approval takes way too long, typically 3 years, and often well above market cost. As a result, today, as you said, 10% of the solar capacity in the U.S. is on federal lands, despite millions of available acres in areas with excellent solar resources. I couldn't agree more. Do you believe that faster permitting timelines would attract significantly more development for renewable projects on federal lands?
Yes.
You also discussed the impediments to development posed by the competitive leasing rule. Again, you and I are in agreement. What changes should be made to the rule to improve investment on federal lands?
Well, right now, a developer doesn't know what the costs are going to be 5 years from now. So there's uncertainty. So let's do something very simple and effective, okay? And cut through the Byzantine rules about how these lease rates are set and just index it to what, for example, grazing rates are. What that's affordable. What it will do is radically increase the percentage of developed solar that's on public land and actually increase the royalty income to the American people by leasing these lands. So I think we just need to have simple economics in place and then roll up our sleeves together and work to make sure that these happen in areas that are not pristine habitats for rare and endangered species.
Now, I'm also interested in your statement about more transmission is necessary. Would you agree that faster permitting for transmission projects, especially out west, would further improve our ability to develop renewables on federal lands?
I would, and I referenced in my testimony an excellent study that was conducted by the National Renewable Energy Lab that basically indicated incredibly strong economic benefits to building selective, targeted transmission to further the national grid. And so that should be combined with market reforms. Often, utilities and regional transmission operators operate their grids as fiefdoms. We need to encourage this both with FERC and modern planning technologies to be able to share energy between regions more easily while we're building strategic transmission. That will enable wind, solar to be developed more quickly, create more jobs, and create more savings for utility customers.
Thank you, Mr. Shugar. Mr. Smith, the immigration program you described for offshore workers sounds very familiar or similar to the optional practical training program, the visas which I and many of my colleagues have been concerned about for quite some time. It is a program that just issues visas that are essentially untracked, unmeasured, with little or no consideration for American workers that visas are replacing. Do you think that if at minimum we simply made the Coast Guard or State Department track the number of visas given to offshore workers, would be a better handle on this issue and more jobs for American workers? Or do you have another idea?
Well, thank you, Ranking Member Gosar. I appreciate the question. Yes, I do believe we need to have better tracking here as one piece of this puzzle. The Coast Guard has, in congressional testimony, said they were not aware of how many people they have had in the United States under these visas. In 2007, they reported they were issuing 4,000 of these visas every year. But what I think needs to happen is I think we need to limit the number of visas to every vessel foreign vessel in here can only have 2.5 times its number of crew visas produced. Additionally, I think that those visas need to match the ownership of the vessel. If you have a Norwegian vessel, you should have a Norwegian crew. If you don't want to have a Norwegian crew, then you can have a U.S. crew. We have plenty of U.S. fully certificated, fully competent mariners that we can have there. Moreover, I think the vessel owners have to come back, prove themselves to the United States Congress on an annual basis. Those three changes, sir, I think can vastly limit this and make more jobs for U.S. mariners. Yes, sir.
So going back to you, Mr. Smith, in regards to the chairman's idea with the making it parable with oil and gas, is there another aspect besides what you just actually talked about it within visas? Is there other aspects that we can actually employ that actually makes it even a better playing field?
You know, what we can do is, again, a lot to the chairman's amendment that will be offered later this week is ensuring that OXLA fully applies to offshore wind development, ensuring that the rules of the road are clear, and ensuring that we have all sorts of parity. Right now, what's called a port state, which is the host country of a vessel, is much less than the flag state. So Coast Guard flag state regs make it more stringent, more safety conscious to operate a U.S. vessel than a foreign vessel, which only receives a port state investigation. So yes, there are numerous ways we can level the playing field between U.S. vessels and foreign vessels.
Thank you very much, Mr. Smith. And Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Ranking member, I'm just going to announce that the order of the Democratic members, and I will be, in terms of questions, Mr. Representative Levin, DeGette, Huffman, and then Cartwright is the order that we have. And so I now recognize Representative Levin for 5 minutes of questions.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our witnesses for appearing before the committee today. I think as the work on this committee shows, renewable energy really is a bipartisan issue. I've been pleased to work with Mr. Gosar and many other colleagues from both sides of the aisle on the Public Land Renewable Energy Development Act, or known as PLREDA, to responsibly increase wind, solar, and geothermal development. That being said, it's been frustrating to hear about the ways that opportunities for both wind and other renewable energy projects on public lands are being squandered. Ms. Kelly, I wanted to turn to you. While the current administration has approved a handful of new projects on public lands, they don't seem to be working to promote new applications for renewable energy on public lands. So my question is, of the projects that have been approved already, how many of those were initially proposed during the last administration?
That's a good question. Our review found that approximately half of the projects approved by the Trump administration started their journey at the BLM during the Obama administration. So there's, I guess, some shared credit and responsibility for some of those projects.
Appreciate that. And of course, BLM can only approve projects if developers want to build on these lands. How would you rate the current administration's efforts to make public lands an attractive place to do business for renewable energy companies?
Yeah, well, I would just add that the Trump administration official was asked to explain the slowdown in projects, essentially said that they just approve what comes in the door. So it's effectively kind of a shrugging the shoulders. They're taking responsibility. What needs to be done is to create the infrastructure to approve these projects. That includes setting up a one-stop shop, a coordination office. It involves creating more designated leasing areas so developers have certainty and predictability about where they can develop. and stakeholders know and can help review to make sure that these are responsibly cited projects. And there's funding needed to make sure that that these can be reviewed on a timely basis. So there's plenty that the administration can do, and things that the Congress can do. As I mentioned earlier, we're in support of RETA, which would help take care of some of the loose ends, the Competitive Wind and Solar Act, revenue sharing, so that local communities benefit, and creates a fund for fish and wildlife conservation as well.
Thank you for that answer. Mr. Shugar, would you agree with that assessment?
We have a great opportunity here. We just really need to get the cost down and certain for developers, and projects will happen. So we just, I set a very simple rate and make it, determine it over the life of the project. No one would buy a house if you have, no idea what your mortgage payment's going to be down the road. It's very similar to that. These rental fees need to be affordable, and the process needs to be quick in how these are approved, and then we'll be able to unleash the potential for public land use.
Ms. Reynolds, I have the same question for you, but specifically related to offshore wind. What steps should the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management take so we can get back on track, especially off the coast of California in areas where any conflicts have been resolved?
Hi, thank you for the question. So BOEM has before it some decisions to make about designating wind energy areas. I mentioned the Wood-Mackenzie study. They looked just at where there were call areas, so where BOEM has already indicated interest in designating wind energy areas. And it's really impressive results for the amount of money for the US Treasury and job creation if they went ahead and designated wind energy areas in the New York Bight, in the Carolinas, off of California, and in the Gulf of Maine. I mentioned also the first permit. It's really imperative to get that decision out there because it's sort of causing a traffic jam with the projects behind it. So if they make a decision on the first permit and then issue notices of intent on the next 6, I think it will create the pipeline of projects that we need to build confidence in the industry growing, build the supply chain, and really get to a position where the U.S. can realize these benefits.
Well, thank you all. I'm out of time, but I really appreciate your support for our bipartisan efforts on this, and I remain absolutely convinced that increasing deployment of renewable energy will help us not only reduce carbon emissions, but it'll put a lot of people back on work at a time when we need to do so. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Levitt. And now recognize Representative Hurd for 5 minutes. Welcome, Representative Hurd.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Leader Gosar, and our witnesses for being with us today. And as a member who supports an all of the above approach to energy production, I'm very interested in discussing the facts surrounding renewable energy initiatives. However, my colleagues across the aisle have routinely made it clear that they do not want to discuss facts regarding their ideas and proposals. So I welcome this hearing today. Whether it be the Green New Deal or other radical mandates, they routinely support policies which would exponentially hurt low-income and minority communities by raising utility costs without exorbitant subsidies, increase the world's carbon footprint by pushing production to countries with minimal regulations, and making America more reliant on foreign adversaries for our energy production. Even from the title, you can see they plan to use this hearing as a platform to further promote these fantasies and to vilify the Trump administration. As a businessman and a non-politician before coming to Washington 2 years ago, I put a lot of value into facts rather than focusing on those vicious practices. Some facts regarding hampered renewable production that my colleagues probably won't share are that rates and fees established by the Obama administration's solar and wind energy rule are often too high to do business on the federal lands. I think that's when we're talking about the costs associated. Current regulatory requirements under NEPA, which my Democrat colleagues support increasing, can drag out the regulatory process for a decade or more, halting these projects to a crawl, as Mr. Sugar's been talking about here. My colleagues will not share those facts, though, or need to address them as it doesn't match what their narrative is. Thankfully, we have a witness here who can shed some light on some of these facts being hampered, that's hampering renewable production. Mr. Smith, in your testimony, you state that it is a perfect time for U.S. mariners to capture offshore wind jobs, but discuss the issues holding these back. So these include great cost disparities between the U.S. and foreign vessels, which you attribute to cheap foreign labor and higher tax and regulatory costs for American vessels. Can you elaborate on this and explain the challenges this causes to the American offshore?
Sure, Congressman. Thank you for the question. I appreciate it. Yes, there are U.S. mariners that are able to do this work. AMSA estimates that possibly as many as 11,000 mariners in the energy space have lost their jobs since the beginning of the COVID-19. So utilizing those mariners, they are readily available. They're waiting for the work. There is huge cost disparities. As said, you know, the employment ad I cited in our testimony had wage rates almost half of what the comparable U.S. positions would cost. Additionally, like I said, Coast Guard port state regs are much less than flag state regs. We routinely find foreign flag vessels can undercut us on those rates. There's additionally tax disparity. There is a tax treaty with Norway that's been incorrectly implemented that allows Norwegian vessels to face zero tax here and basically zero tax in Norway as well. So all of those yield, we have had instances reported to my members where a contract was taken from a U.S. vessel given to a foreign vessel because the foreign vessel was able to operate 25% less expensive. That shouldn't happen in our own waters. I'm sorry, Congressman, I couldn't hear the question.
We could not hear.
It keeps muting and unmuting. Could you share what some of the solutions would be, or some simple solutions that Congress could do?
Sure thing, Congressman. Appreciate the question again. Number one, I think what we need to do is these foreign vessels need to once a year prove their ownership structure. These vessels have a very complex international ownership structure. We should know who owns these vessels, just like U.S. vessels have to prove their ownership every year. Second, we should only allow each vessel to create a limited number of visas. We should not have visas holders here that can come in on any vessel anytime they want. Thirdly, the visa holders should match the flag of the vessel. If you have a Norwegian vessel, you should have Norwegian mariners. If you don't like Norwegian mariners, then you should be employing U.S. mariners. Those are three simple changes. We could address this disparity very quickly.
Thank you, Mr. Smith. I appreciate your insight and your time today. And in the future, I hope that we can all work together. Mr. Levin said this, we can work in a bipartisan way to get some of these issues solved. Again, it's necessary that we have to win energy. We just need to be all treated equally and fair and make sure that we don't abuse the laws that we have, so that we pay everyone equally.
Thank you, Congressman.
Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Hearn. I now recognize Representative DeGette for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank the whole panel. Mr. Smith, I particularly want to thank you because I learned a lot from your testimony today. Colorado not being a maritime state, we don't spend a lot of time thinking about things like these visas. So thank you for that information. I want to talk, though, a little bit about what's going on federal lands with drilling, fracking, and mining. Just recently, the Trump administration submitted a plan to expand drilling, fracking, and mining across 1.7 million acres in southwestern Colorado, which, by the way, is one of the fastest warming areas of the country. And there were 57,000 total public comments on that plan. 53,000 of the 57,000 opposed the leasing. And what happened after that, several climate groups sued the Trump administration over that plan. I happen to agree with that lawsuit that the BLM violated federal law by not analyzing how oil, gas, and coal development could harm organic agriculture, the climate, and endangered species. But even beyond the facts of the analysis, I think the whole process shows a disregard for the notion of public comment itself, since all but 4,000 of the public comments oppose this. And so I wanted to ask you, Ms. Kelly, the people of Colorado said they don't want to see this type of fossil fuel development on public lands. They really want to see more renewables. Is that true across the country, or are we just seeing that in Colorado?
Thanks for the question, Congresswoman. I think that sentiment is borne out by pretty much every poll I have seen in recent years. One recently out of Colorado College supported that many voters are ready to transition to a clean energy future. They think we can transition to a clean energy future, and they are really seeing the impacts of the fossil fuel-based economy on their land, water, wildlife, public health, and beyond. So I think Americans are really ready to transition away from fossil fuels.
Well, if the poll came from Colorado College, it's probably absolutely precise, since that's my alma mater. I went to college there. I want to ask you the same thing on the other side of the coin. Do you think that, or does the public, has there been analysis about how the public feels about developing renewable energy on public lands?
Yes, these same polls would show that wind, solar, and geothermal are sources of energy that Americans feel confident about and excited about. I think that, not that we base all things on polls, but it would show that it's not only the right thing to do, but the popular thing to do to transition to wind and solar energy.
Now, I've got a bill that I've introduced, which sets a clean energy standard, and it increases the revenue coming to renewable energy facilities, which, once the royalty issues are fixed, brings in additional revenue to local communities. And so several of our witnesses today talked about how we need to create more jobs in clean energy. Do you think, Ms. Reynolds, I'm wondering if you can talk about how giving relief like this to create jobs in renewable energy impacts us versus giving handouts to fossil energy in the form of tax relief and other types of relief.
Thanks for the question. Well, I can comment on that from New York. I mentioned at the beginning of my testimony that there's 158,000 clean energy jobs in New York, and that number had increased 0.9% from 2016. It was growing at twice the rate of other jobs in the state of New York. And it's a direct result of the clean energy standard that we have here in New York, which was first 50% and then by law was changed to 70%. It's a really aggressive goal, and we're working hard to get there, but much of the support for it is due to job creation and is due to local tax revenue in rural parts of the state that could really use that revenue. So by setting a set policy, we can start to realize those economic benefits.
Yeah, I'm on the Energy and Commerce Committee also, as well as this one, and we're finding that if we can create jobs in renewable energy, it's a huge growth factor for the future versus existing oil and gas jobs. Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back. Thanks to all our witnesses.
Thank you. Ranking Member Gosar, I don't believe we have any more Republicans sitting right now on the panel, so I'm going to continue on with the Democratic members. And just interrupt me if I'm not correct. So, but our next next person is Representative Huffman. You have 5 minutes to ask questions. Welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And that was a fascinating hypothetical that my friend, the ranking member, engaged in with one of the witnesses. What if we just did away with NEPA review? For those of us that feel like we've been living through a fossil fuel dystopia, it is interesting to note that it could get even worse. And I think my friend maybe said the quiet part out loud a little while ago, because normally when we talk about gutting NEPA with our Republican colleagues, they profess support for NEPA, our most important bedrock environmental law. They just say they want to improve it. But we got the full Monty a little while ago, and I think the quiet part was said out loud and we see a lot about the Republican agenda when it comes to NEPA. Worth noting, 42 days before the election. Mr. Chairman, thank you for the opportunity to come together and to discuss the Trump administration's oil of the above energy policy. And I would like to start my questions with Kate Kelly. And Ms. Kelly, you alluded to the contrast between renewables and fossil fuel. But I'm going to ask you to elaborate a little more on specific ways the Trump administration has really gone out of its way to deliver for the fossil fuel industry, which just so happens to be Secretary Bernhardt's former clients. It seems to me that the unprecedented rush to do fossil fuel lease sales recently, at a time when the world is awash with oil, when gas and oil prices are at historic lows, and the value for taxpayers is terrible. They're literally giving away our natural resources for pennies on the dollar, the Arctic Refuge lease sale being the poster child for this recklessness. But I want to hear your thoughts, and I want to ask if you could elaborate a little bit more on some of the specific ways that the Trump administration is doing this.
Yeah, thanks for your question, Congressman Huffman. Yeah, I think by pretty much any comparison, the Trump administration is favoring oil and gas over renewable energy. The pandemic has brought that to bear. I'll give two quick examples. Lease sales, for example, the Trump administration has gone out of their way to hold frequent quarterly lease sales. They have offered over 24 million of acres since 2017 to the oil and gas industry. They are planning to offer another 500,000 acres by the end of this year. During the pandemic, this is happening, as you mentioned, at a time when there is low demand and an oil glut. So these acres are going many unsold, and those that are selling are often at the minimum bid of $2 an acre. Well, for renewable energy, they have offered a total of 0 acres for sale and held 0 competitive lease sales during the pandemic, but also during their first term. The second example I would offer is royalty rates during the pandemic. They they processed over 700 applications for royalty rate relief, granted 70% of those, some to the tune of 5.5% royalty rate for oil and gas. Whereas for wind and solar, they offered massive retroactive rental payments in the midst of a pandemic after years of ignoring requests from the industry for relief or discussion about those bills. So there is a huge juxtaposition between the two industries.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Ms. Reynolds, does that sound similar to the situation offshore, this huge disconnect between the preference given to fossil fuel and our need to develop more renewables?
Well, since I'm from New York, I'll focus my answer just on New York. I think it was in 2017 and 18 when the Trump administration broached opening up a lot of offshore areas to drilling that New York, like many states, both Democratic and Republican led up and down the seaboard, really vehemently opposed that. And in fact, in 2019, New York passed a law banning oil and gas drilling in state waters and any infrastructure, which wouldn't be an outright prohibition in federal waters, of course, but would really complicate it. So in stark contrast, New York has been asking for a wind energy area to be designated in the New York Bight. There's so much support for offshore wind development. What we need to move ahead is that lease off the coast of New York and New Jersey. So there has been a difference there, but we're really hoping that BOEM can turn it around and move ahead with that lease.
Appreciate that. I yield back, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Huffman. Now I recognize Representative Cartwright for 5 minutes of questions. Cartwright, can you unmute? Thank you. I'm not able to hear you, Mr. Cartwright. I do others.
How about now? Can you hear me now?
Now we can, yes.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I want to say I quite agree with my colleague, Congressman Huffman, when he alludes to the idea that the quiet part is being said out loud when we create this equivalence between the importance of expanding renewable energy on public lands and this idea that we ought to do the same thing for fossil fuels. Look, this is about climate change, folks. Climate change is real. Climate change is a world emergency. Rising temperatures and a prolonged drought have contributed to wildfires that have burned over 3.6 million acres in California this year alone. For only the second time in recorded history, the National Hurricane Center has used all 26 letters for named hurricanes and has had to resort to going to the Greek alphabet to continue to name hurricanes. I've seen firsthand destruction extreme weather can cause in my own home state of Pennsylvania. In 2018, Pennsylvania had the wettest summer on record. There's a reason for these things. The precipitation in Pennsylvania has led to historic flooding and landslides, resulting in damaged infrastructure, destroyed businesses and homes, numerous deaths. These historic floods and landslides ultimately led to over $125 million in infrastructure replacement costs. The effects of climate change are real and will only get worse the longer we do little or nothing. Now, Ms. Kelly, I want to ask you the first question. As you know, states throughout the country are looking to expand their renewable energy portfolio, capitalizing on affordability and minimal climate impacts. One of the options to expand renewable energy production is placing utility-scale renewable projects on public lands. Now, despite this being an attractive option, these projects still make up a very small share of overall electricity production in this country. The question is, how much room is there for growth on public lands for wind, solar, and geothermal energy?
Thanks for the question, Congressman. There's a ton of room for growth on public lands. I think right now, wind, solar, and geothermal on public lands only makes up about 5% of the US's total generating capacity of wind, solar, and geothermal, and that just doesn't make sense. I think there's huge potential for development with the existing designated leasing areas, both onshore and offshore, to put hundreds more projects and power millions more homes, but there's also room to expand those designated leasing areas through additional land management planning in places where there's high solar like Southern Nevada or high wind like Southern Utah. There's lots of potential to expand those existing leasing areas, and these places are often close to population centers, and so there's a need to make that happen as well.
Thank you for that. Mr. Shugar, I'm going to turn to you. Does that reflect your understanding of the solar potential on public lands?
Let's start with this. You can take a circle that's about 90 miles radius, and that would power the entire country from solar. That would fit, most of that would fit on the larger Nellis Air Force Base, you know, if you look at the expanded areas around some of those. So there's ample land. One thing that's been, I think, with all due respect, Congress folks, I think we need to move on from, gee, these rules were set in previous administrations holding us back. It's been 4 years, okay? So we just need to simplify and just move on. I'd encourage.
I'm going to take that as a yes, Mr. Shugar. I got to finish my questions. I'm going to take that as a yes, and I thank you for your great testimony today. Because Ms. Reynolds, I want to finish with you. What about offshore wind? How much room is there to grow for offshore wind on public lands?
Offshore has so much amazing potential, and there's goals in the Eastern Seaboard now to add up to 25.4 gigawatts. So we are hoping in New York State that our 9,000 megawatts of offshore wind would provide 30% of the electricity that New York State will use in 2030.
Thank you for that. And I want to turn to you last, Mr. Smith. You said something intriguing in response to a question Chairman Lowenthal asked you. You said this: we've had to drag the administration kicking and screaming to enforce our laws offshore. You said that. What was that about? What were you talking about?
We have had a constant challenge in both oil and gas and in renewable energies in having to ensure that our laws are correctly enforced offshore. This problem has existed since 1976, actually predating OXLA, with the administration issuing, both administrations issuing more than 160 letter rulings which allow foreign vessels to move merchandise between 2 points in the United States. It's been unfortunate. We have twice the administration has said these letter rulings were illegal, and they kept them in place. And finally, in 2019, only revoked 5 of the 25 they had originally tried to. So we have been working to get the law correctly enforced ever since 2009, and just have been stymied at every turn.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
That's going to conclude the questions from the members. But at the conclusion of each of these panels, I would like to ask each panel member, I'll start with Ms. Kelly. What question would you have liked us to have asked you? And how would you respond to that? And then I'll go on to Ms. Reynolds, Mr. Shugar, and Mr. Smith. So Ms. Kelly, if there isn't anything, if you think we've asked all the questions, then just say we don't have any question that you'd like us. What question would you have liked us, Ms. Kelly, to have asked you? And how would you respond to that?
That's a fun bonus round. I would say one question is NEPA the boogeyman, as it is made out to be by members of this panel? And I think one example I'd like to point to is that that we have a system that can work when implemented properly. The example is there's a designated leasing area put out in southern Nevada, which was found to have high solar potential and low environmental conflict. 3 solar developers then proposed projects for approval in that, and those projects were approved in 10 months. Because they were sited in the right place. They were smart from the start, so to speak. So I think that we have a model that when implemented and with the right funding can work to speed, efficient and effective and environmentally responsible wind and solar projects.
Ms. Reynolds, is there any question you would have liked to have been asked, and how would you respond to that?
Well, most of my answers have been quite provincial to New York State, so I'll continue with that. Why is this so important to New York State that the federal government move ahead with supporting offshore wind? And the simple answer is we have a lot of people that live on the coast in the New York metropolitan area. We have an extremely windy offshore resource, and without being able to tap into that and know where the wind energy areas are so we can plan transmission, we're sort of stuck with lesser options for achieving our climate goals. So we're looking for the federal government to be a partner in helping us reach our now legal mandate for 70% renewables. And thank you so much.
What would you like to add that we didn't ask you?
The question would be, beyond what we can do with federal land stewardship, what are other policies that can be done to accelerate renewable energy development on federal lands, providing jobs and lower utility costs? I summarized those in my written testimony and briefly in my oral testimony. We need to reduce or eliminate tariffs. We need to build transmission. And we need to address the impact on leveraging the successful tax credit policy, which has been vetted by partisan way for over a decade, but make that work with this problem we're having with COVID and the economic conditions by having refundability of the tax credit. Then we can really win at all the above. Everyone wants clean air, clean water, more jobs and lower bills. And we have the land to do it. So we just need to get on with it and sit down and together create some basic rules. So that would be the question and the response I would hope for.
Thank you. And Mr. Smith, what question would you like to elaborate on, or did we not ask that you'd like to answer?
I love the feature, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for it. The question would be why is the maritime industry not only important to offshore energy development, but to the nation? And what my response would be is that the men and women who serve on OMSA member vessels are allowed to also serve in the MARAD's Ready Reserve Force, the force that transports our warfighters to foreign nations and to foreign shores during times of conflict. And without the steady commercial work that they have on our vessels, they end up they lose their license because of inactivity, and they can't participate in that force. Moreover, the vessels that have been constructed for our industry are also built in the same shipyards that are building vessels for the United States Navy and for the Coast Guard. So the U.S. commercial maritime directly supports our national security. Moreover, having these foreign nationals from nations that don't have our best interest at heart with limited oversight on our shores creates a huge homeland security problem, in addition to the fact that they're taking jobs from United States citizens. So our industry is important for our nation's economic, homeland, and national security. Again, I thank you for the question, Chairman.
I want to thank all the witnesses for their testimony and all the members for their questions. The members of this committee may have some additional questions for the witnesses, and we will ask you to respond to these in writing. Under Committee Rule 3.0, members of the committee must submit witness questions within 3 business days following the hearing, and the hearing record will be kept open for 10 additional days for these responses. If there's no further business, without objection, this committee stands adjourned. Bye now.